Heat pressed down like a hand over King's Landing, drawing the scent of trampled grass and horse from the Tourney grounds and braiding it with the butter smoke of roasted capons and the salt breath of the Blackwater. Banners lapped at a slow wind, crimson lions, stags rampant, suns and roses bright as fruit. Laughter rolled beneath the galleries like a tide, breaking now and again against the iron rasp of a blacksmith's file, the sudden neigh of a nervous destrier, the distant rattle of practice arms in the lists. Arya Stark moved through it all like a stray cat, all elbows and knees and narrow, watchful eyes. Sweat tickled between her shoulder blades beneath the coarse linen of a borrowed boy's shirt. She had smudged soot across her cheeks and bound up her hair, and she had needle, slim and secret, flattened to her spine beneath the shirt and tied with string as Syrio had taught her, so that it did not slap her ribs when she ran. She tasted dust and thought of frozen mornings at Winterfell, the steam rising from the horses, Bran's laughter as he chased a snowball, Robb's breath fogging as he grinned at her over a practiced sword, their father watching them like a mountain that walked and spoke. The thought only sharpened her. She did not want Winterfell with its cold courtyards and her sister's stitchery and her mother's eyes, tired and proud. She wanted the shape of another memory, the butcher's boy with his hands cracked by cold, his face amazed when she had offered him a stick to spar and he had laughed, that raw, bright laugh that snapped when the prince and the hound had found them by the river. The memory had edges, Joffrey Baratheon's pretty sneer, the gleam of wine in the boy's hair, red as blood, and later, red as blood, Lady's soft warmth in the night, and the silence that followed. Syrio's voice floated up from the deep well where she had set it, light and disdainful. Swiftly now. See with all your eyes. The water dances in the space you have, little cat. In the spaces others do not think are there. Those spaces were everywhere if you learned to find them. She had hunted cats for a week in the Red Keep's hollow bones. She had tracked by the skitter of tiny claws, by the smear of dust along a stone, by the faint musky print a tail left when it swept near a step. Now she hunted something else, and the tourney gave her cover. The great lords and ladies glittered beneath colored awnings, and the commons screamed for the slam of wood on wood as the lances broke. Joffrey was there on the high dais, below the king, his hair the color of old gold hammered thin, his lips curved in a smirk that was almost a pout. The sun took him up like a bauble and showed him to everyone, as if he were something worth looking at. He laughed at a Tyrell boy whose lance shattered too early. He leaned to say something to Sansa that made her head bend, hands folded too neatly in her lap. Arya could not see her sister's face from here, but she knew the angle of that neck, the way the ribbon would be tied, the careful stillness learned from Septa Mordane. She felt the old ache of wanting and resentment, and then the harder thing that cleaved those in two. Love like a knot tied tight and hidden in cloth. The first course had fallen to a reach night and drew out a dozen courtesies and hat sweeps. Someone thrust a meat pie under Arya's nose and told her to buy or move. She moved. She slid off the packed path into the shade of the platform's underbelly, where stout posts rose like the trunks of a small forest and shadows held the smell of spilled wine, rotting leaves, the breath of damp earth. Servants ducked in and out, balancing trays slick with fat, rattling pitchers that sweated in the heat. A veil of painted cloth fell along the back of the royal dais like a summer curtain, its figures of hunting stags and forest maidens faded and puckered by years. Beyond it lay a slice of cool dimness. Two guards in crimson cloaks kept sullen watch at a gap, their heads turning by habit to the thunder of hooves, a reflex as ancient as the horse. Arya watched them as the races fell into a rhythm. Thunder, roar, smash, laugh. Thunder, roar, smash, laughter and scold. The men's mouths moved with their talk, their eyes snagging always toward the sound of spectacle. In those snags lived the breath between steps, the room for a shadow to pass. She kept to the pillars. She learned the round of their glances the way she had learned a cat's tolerance for a reaching hand. When thunder rose and voices sharpened, the night of flowers, the mountain that rides. The closer man leaned outward, and the farther man had a habit of rubbing his thumb against his index finger as if he sought to chase a splinter from his skin. That was when she slid. A truckle boy with a tray stumbled and cursed. The nearer guard turned to rebuke, the farther lifted his chin, and Arya's breath and body moved together. She was inside the curtain, pressed to its womb of cool and dusk. The thudding of hooves was a heartbeat made monstrous. The air inside smelled of wax and perfume, the bitter breath of pine oil on polished wood. She crouched, small as a knot, the drape brushing her hair. Through a slit in its seam, Arya saw the back of the high seat, the gleam of the king's crown where he sat slouched preposterously, the weight of jewels heavy even on iron. Cersei's hair tumbled like sunlight poured into a goblet. Between the king and queen sat Joffrey, spine straight as if a rod lived in it, chin high, a bored prince waiting for praise. Her own breath grew loud in her ears. She pressed her palms on her thighs until she felt the prickle of sweat between skin and linen, and she thought of Syrio again, not only his words but how he had looked when he faced her, empty-handed, as she swung needle at him. A wooden sword leaps the same as steel if the hand is sure, and always the first sound is the sound inside you. If it is too loud, all the world will hear it. Make the sound small. She made it small. She made it a bead of water in a stone bowl. In the lusty clamor beyond, the names rose again. The night of flowers, pale as a pretty god. The mountain, gross and terrible. A roar like breaking storm rolled over the lists and burst against the dais. The cloth of the curtain lifted on the force of it, letting a blade of sunlight cut across her knee. On the field, the mountain's warhorse screamed as the bright boy's lance struck true and a shower of flowers seemed to fly unmoored into the air. Arya could not see it, but she could feel the crowd lean, could feel the moment the great man lost his temper, for it was as if a wolf had drawn breath near the rabbit warren. The king laughed, big and booming.
Stilrang.
A bitch's shriek ran thin and high. Sansa's voice, Arya knew it, terror twisting it thinner. Then Sandor Clegane's bark answered, harsh and cutting off what might have become slaughter. The crowd seized and swallowed itself in 100 small movements. The curtain breathed. The nearer guard outside the drape forgot his post and pressed forward like everyone else. The other shouted and followed. There, the space. Syrio had said, when the world looks one way, go the other. When they lean in, you lean out. When they shout up, you look down with ears that swim. She slid along the edge of the drape to the carved rail behind the seats. The high steps up to the dais lay to her right, empty for the blink of an eye. She bounded them with a cat's economy, landing with her weight in the balls of her feet, hands already finding purchase along the carved paneling at the back of the king's chair. She could see through tiny gaps where the joiners had left the wood imperfect. The king's shoulder, a portion of his jaw, the feathered quiver of his jests. Cersei's hand tightening on the armrest as a lover might tighten on a wrist. Sansa's hands pale as doves. Joffrey's profile, fine-boned, superior, a lip like a little knife. He was leaning forward, one elbow braced by the rail, attention caught by the spectacle of his dog at work. Sandor had loosed his helm and thrown it aside. Hair dark as old straw clung to his sweaty head. He and the mountain moved like a storm breaking itself on itself, blow meeting blow in a shiver that ran through the planks beneath Arya. The world's roar had gone dim in her ears, and Syrio's voice was a mere thread now. The heat was a smell and a weight and a taste. Everything had become the ribs of the wooden backrest beneath her fingers, the slits of the carving, the slight shift of a boy prince's shoulder. She drew needle. It came away from her spine like water, thin and shining and not heavy at all. A full blade would have scraped. This sliver sang no louder than her breath. She slid its point into the slit between carved leaves, saw it wink just to the left of Joffrey's elbow. Her heart did not stumble. She could feel the places in the body where armor lay and where it did not. Not armor. He wore silk and velvet, and the hard little pride children wear like a gorget. But beneath there were ribs. Beneath there was a place where flesh met bone in a tender smallness. Needle had found that place in her practice 1,000 times because Syrio had shown her where most men forget they are soft. Stick them with the pointy end, Jon had said, half jest and half blessing. If she had allowed herself anything, it might have been to hear his voice for the space of one breath, but she did not. She lined her sight down the sliver's length, gathered the world at the fixed point where steel meant meat, and when Sandor drove the mountain back a half step and the prince leaned in delight, she pushed forward with her whole body, as if her weight were the weight of a wave rolling up a beach, unstoppable because it had begun long ago, in another season, by another river. The steel went in under his arm, where the pulse lives quiet and strong. It slid between ribs as if it had always meant to be there. There was no roar from the crowd to cover the small sound he made, which surprised her. It was a breath, startled, like the soft awe of a child who has seen a trick he cannot explain. She drew the blade out. It was reddened and bright in the same moment, and then it was gone under her shirt, and she was a shadow at the back of the dais again, already descending, each step a decision she did not stop to consider. The world resumed itself like a dropped harp shuddering back to stillness. On the lists, Sandor had forced his brother away from the boy he had saved, and Loras Tyrell was pale and perfect again, and the king was roaring approval, and Cersei's hand had loosed the chair and found Joffrey's sleeve, and Sansa was turning with a smile that had been meant for a rescuer and found only a boy prince whose eyes had grown wide with a curious thought. He looked down at himself as if trying to puzzle out the shape of his own breath. Blood darkened his fine doublet. His mouth opened and closed, and his cheek made the briefest, smallest pout. Then he folded, not as a hero folds, but as a boy who is tired of standing, sliding to the planks in a hush that confused the moment before it terrified it. Everything that followed came with a speed too quick for one pair of eyes to follow. The hound turning without an order, the mountain bellowing something that became nothing beneath the scream of 100 throats, the king's fist crashing to wood, Cersei crying his name and not his name, the guards surging, their boots a drumbeat on the stairs. Arya slid beneath the drape like a fish into weed, found the pillar's spine with her back and felt how alone she was and how absolutely full with the thing she had done. The air went cold in her lungs. Her hands did not shake until a cupbearer blundered into her and the wine pitcher he carried sent a ruby fan across the dirt. Then her fingers seized, panic snatching at the sinew. She forced her breath down hard into her belly. Move, she thought, and did. In the space of 6 heartbeats, the aisles beneath the galleries filled with color and threat. She could not go back the way she had come. The pillars were crowded now with men in red cloaks and men in black and gold, whose eyes swept low and high and low again, hungry to find someone to soothe their alarm with. A servant girl with hair bright as corn sobbed into her apron. Arya ducked under a trestle table and came up in a drift of shadows behind a row of stacked crates stenciled with a crown. Through the slats she saw Sandor Clegane, face hard as hammered leather, profile like a cruel coin, shouldering men aside as if they were screens of reed. His sword was bare. Joffrey's blood had painted nothing on him because it had been too private to splash yet. An intimacy between blade and body that had hidden itself even from those who loved the sight of violence. That felt right and wrong at once. She half limped, half ran along the line of the crates, felt splinters snag at her shirt and tore free. She came upon an open stretch where the grass had been stamped into a slick green-brown mat. On the other side, colored tents jutted like the teeth of a crooked smile. Their guy ropes a web waiting for the unwary. Arya took one breath, then another, then darted into the teeth. The ropes snagged but did not claim her. She ducked the low arc of a flap, shouldered a post that had been badly hammered and gave a little beneath her weight, and ran until the roar of the crowd was a muffled anger behind her and the tents had become an alleyway, close and dim. "Hoy, lad," a voice said, flat as a file, soft as soot. "What's the hurry?" The man had a face a crow might like. He was all edges and darkness, with a beard that sprang every which way. His cloak was travel-worn and black, his eyes weary and sharp both, as if nothing surprised him anymore and everything still could. A feather showed at his shoulder. Arya skidded. Her hand went where needle lay and found only the rasp of linen. She bit hard on her lip, tasting copper. The man's eyes flickered to the movement, then away, as if they had learned politeness in cruel company. "Easy," he muttered. "I don't need your coppers, but I can tell when a fire's coming, and you're smoking like a thatch in drought." He shifted aside, as if to let a breeze pass. His gaze slid past her shoulder toward the roar that had grown suddenly pitched, female and furious. What have they done now, then? Arya wanted to say nothing. She wanted to push by and vanish, to become a name said later with wonder, or a nightmare told by candlelight, or nothing at all. Syrio would have said, "The silence can speak, little cat, let it." But the man's cloak caught at the corner of her eye, black with a feather, so familiar it was almost comfort. Jon had talked of it when he talked of the wall. The men in black who wore vows like armor and were laughed at by those who had never seen beyond a winter storm. The Night's Watch, he had said, and his voice had held a strange, sad pride in it. "There is honor yet in some places, Arya. I will find it. They're going to kill me," she said, and wondered if saying it made it more true or less. Or my father, or Sansa, or everybody. He squinted, head canted like a bird. He said after a heartbeat, "Somebody has likely done something very ill-advised. You've the look of a wolf pup that's bitten the wrong hound." His mouth tugged at a corner, not a smile. "Name's Yoren." Arya did not give him hers. She could not get it past the knot in her throat. He saw that. His eyes narrowed in a way that was not unkind. "Well," Yoren said, "best put out that smoke. Black will swallow you easier than any color, if you've the stomach for flea bites and lying still. This way." He turned without waiting to see if she would follow. His stride was loose and lazy, which let him move faster than a man who tried. Arya's feet found the rhythm of it because she had learned to find rhythms and move with them. They slunk behind a row of barrels and slid between two wagons that had been parked too close, their wheels nearly kissing. Yoren raised a flap that hid a darkness within darkness, a labyrinth of casks and sacks, the smell of grain and damp wood and old leather. He jerked his head, and she slipped inside like the small, quick thing she was. He dropped the flap and the world quieted. He moved something, sacks maybe, and she felt the lightest weight settle over her. Straw pricked the back of her neck. Yoren's close whisper smelled of old ale. "Don't scratch. Don't cough. If a rat nibbles your ear, pretend you like it. I'll say you're barley if any man asks. There'll be more of us in a day or so. Keep still." He was gone, then with the easy backward slither of a man who knew how not to be seen. Arya lay with her cheek pressed to the wood. She could hear the world as if through a door left just ajar. The continuing uproar, the barked orders, the sound of boots like rain on hard ground. She let the sound wash her. Joffrey's face rose before her, the delicate contempt of it, the soft surprise. She did not feel triumph. She felt a hollow like the one that lived under the old weirwood's roots, a place where water went to think. The list in her head changed without her consent, adjusting as winter changes the weight of a pine, dropping some snow and bearing the rest. The name at its top did not fade because he was not a name anymore. He was a thing she had done. She would have to carry it in a pocket where she could find it when she needed to remember who she was and who she was not. In the light, Sandor Clegane stood above a prince who would never be a king and understood that the shape of his days had been broken. He did not care for the boy. He cared for duty as one cares for a scar, because it is there and cannot be wished away. The prince had liked to make him kneel for jests, had spoken to him the way boys speak to dogs they have not learned to love. None of that mattered. The boy was a stone in a line of stones he had been set to guard, and some hand had kicked the stone aside. Sandor felt the old fire prick at his cheek, the place where his life had been made ugly. He felt the old fear stir with the anger, a child's fear wrapped in a giant's rage. He looked around for somewhere to put it and found Sansa Stark's face. She had clapped when the pretty boy had ridden. She had leaned forward, all roses, when the prince stood. Now she was small and white, lips cracked open, eyes too blue. He had saved her earlier from his brother's madness without thinking. He had saved her because there had been a sword in his hand and a task he was made for. He saw her faint and caught her before she could split that milk-white brow on the dais. She weighed almost nothing. He hated her for it, and for her smell of innocence and lemon cakes, and for the tremor that returned to his hands unbidden. "Hold!" he growled to a guard whose panic drove him to shove past. "Hold, damn you!" To the king he said, "He's cut. Deep." The mountain's helm turned toward him, then away, as if some choice had been offered and refused. Cersei's mouth had become a slash. "Stop the bleeding," she said in a voice that had heard boys cry before and not been swayed by it. "Get Maester Pycelle. Clear the dais. Where is Ser Barristan? Where is—" "Here, your grace," said Barristan Selmy, white as a falcon in winter. His face had become an old man's face in a breath. Sandor could not tell whether it was grief or duty that had done it, but he knew which would win. "Back," Barristan said to the press of guards, and the room obeyed him because this was a man who had told it to obey him all his life. The king had stopped roaring. His breath sat heavy on the world, the stink of wine and meat and a hint of fear. He looked down at the boy with an expression on Sandor had not thought his face could make. A kind of surprise, and beneath it, something like a memory lit from behind. "Joff," he said, as if the name were a horse's name. He stooped and called again, short and hard. The boy did not answer. Blood slicked the wood and darkened velvet like spilled ink. "Find me the bastard that did this," Robert Baratheon said then, each word as big as his fist. "Find me the bloody rat, and bring me his head." The city held its breath. Then it began to run. Crimson cloaks poured from everywhere. Janos Slint's voice lifted above others, thick with authority and the greasy pleasure of it. "Lock the gates," he shouted. "Search the tents. Search the kitchens. No one in or out." He did not say please. He did not need to. Peter Baelish watched with the bright, cold interest of a man who has seen the board upended and runs his thumb along his teeth to taste the new lines. He had given Sansa a smile when Joffrey had spoken to her, because smiles were coins that cost him nothing and bought him what men with swords murdered to get. Now he moved among the chaos without being part of it. He leaned and murmured to a captain here, nodded to a furious lord there. He saw Eddard Stark standing to one side of the dais, his face like stone ground down by an old glacier. Baelish was fond of stones. They were predictable. You could set them rolling if you nudged them and be confident of where they would go. Lord Eddard did not move right away. His eyes were on Sansa. That was good, Baelish thought. Let him care about the wrong thing for a heartbeat more. Let Cersei begin. Let the king choose the wrong help, as he always did. Varys glided up beside him, the silk of his steps as quiet as spider thread. "A pity," the eunuch murmured. His eyes were damp, sincere, or well made to be. And yet, a bigger pity averted. And what was that? Baelish did not look at him. Varys's breath tickled. A king raised to be a fire with no hearth to contain him. So many of us would have burned before winter ever did. Baelish smiled without teeth. You hoped his brother would be gentler? Or that Stannis would accept what you know he will not? There are too many boards now. Even a spider has only so many legs. Ah, the eunuch's voice chided like a flute. But a spider's webs are not his legs. Cersei was speaking to the king, her voice pitched low and urgent. She gestured, and Baelish saw the moment when she decided how to tell this story. A stark crime, a northern slight elevated into treason. Lannister guards had found a boy's cap beneath the dais, dark-haired, small. Could be any cap. It would be Arya's. The queen did not need proof when she had a city full of men who needed her fear more than her reason. Yoren told Arya a story about grain when a soldier thrust his spear into the wagon. His voice got thicker and more provincial and more stupid with every word, until Arya almost believed him herself. The way he grumbled about his cousin's cousin who had promised him sacks on a certain day and then gone and died on him, lazy as dogs get in summer. The soldier made a face and let the tip of his spear crumple into the sack nearest Arya's head. Chaff breathed against her cheek. She did not cough. Yoren scratched and picked his teeth and made a noise like an old horse. When the spear went away and the boots moved on, Arya did not move either. She learned that stillness had its own weight, and that holding it required a strength she had never yet used. Later, when twilight deepened, the wagon creaked and Yoren's hands did something that unfastened the backboard, and he spoke to someone who sounded like a boy, ragged and cocky, and to someone who sounded like a man who measured out words because he had few to spare, and then he said, "Quiet now." And then the night became a road. Under a sliver moon, the wagons of the Night's Watch drifted out of King's Landing like a bit of flotsam that had mistaken itself for a ship. The gates were more tightly watched than a miser's purse. But Yoren had been doing this for years, and he had learned the names of the men who wanted a drink, and the men who wanted a story, and the men who wanted to feel important saying no. He gave each of them the thing he wanted, and when none of them asked for blood, he gave thanks without saying the word. Inside the city, the hand of the king went home to his tower and found that home had changed. Sansa clung to him until he had to peel her fingers from his sleeve. He did not scold her. He did not soothe her either. His face was the expression he had worn when he had judged a poacher who had cut a deer's throat to feed 7 children. And the man had wept when Ned had sent his hand flying. "He bled," Sansa said, shaking. "Father, he fell and he bled and his eyes were so. He looked like a little boy. He looked like—" She could not say Bran. Ned put a hand under her elbow and led her to the fire. Septa Mordane hovered, pale and determined as a wall candle. "We will speak no more of this tonight," Ned said. The words were a mercy and an evasion both. He was thinking of Arya and not saying so. He had sent guards to search. He had told Jory to go and keep a clear head. He had told himself all the ways a girl could be alive in a city with 1,000 holes. After Sansa had been guided to bed, her steps lagging, Ned sat a while with the map of the 7 kingdoms before him. The candlelight made the thick parchment glow like old bone. This was a thing he knew in his marrow, where the river crossed here and the ford there, and where a man could go in 6 days that took a horse 5.5. He could measure a season by the snowmelt and tell you whether a bridge would be iced 2 weeks hence. But he could not measure the path Cersei would choose now, or whether Robert would choose his wife or his friend when the choosing came. He should go to Robert now with the book in his hand, the book of lineages fat as any priest's belly, its lists of hair color and eyes like a ledger's column. He should tell him plainly what he had learned and let the king decide between his rage and his love with all Westeros looking on. That had been the plan he made when plans were still things that stayed obedient after you set them down. Now the prince lay dead, and the queen's grief had teeth, and the city had become a mouth. He thought of Arya's face when she wanted, and he thought of the lists she scribbled in her head when she was angry. He had tried to teach her mercy by telling her mercy's cost. You paid for it with the thing you wanted to keep, and you paid gladly or it was not mercy. But he had taught her with words, and words are the poorest teachers when blood is a better one. He rose and found the night air with his hands. On the ramparts, the sea spoke to the stones. He looked out and saw nothing but dark. Renly Baratheon came to him at dawn with the smell of horses and oil still in his mouth. "You know she will blame your girl," he said without pleasantries. His face was pale from a night spent awake. "Cersei will have Lannister men at every gate. She will call it treason, and 100 suitors will line up to agree. My daughter did not do this." Renly lifted a brow. "What do we know of what our children do, Lord Eddard? We teach them the things we know, and the world teaches them the things we forgot." He paced, graceful even when he was angry. "It does not matter. Perhaps your girl did nothing at all. Perhaps she did everything. The queen will make the tale she needs. We must make ours." "Yours," Ned said, because he had heard him correctly. Renly's mouth tightened. "You still think loyalty is a feast set for all and not a wedge that cuts a pie," he said softly. "Stannis will come with ships and righteousness, but he will come slow. The city will fall into Cersei's hands like a coin into a purse long before he staggers down the stairs to pick it up. I have men who will move when the door cracks. Loras is not the only flower who knows swords." Ned looked at him, measuring a boy who liked bright cloaks and his own jokes and comparing him to a man who might be king because the world abhorred a vacancy. "You would draw your sword on your brother? And you would take the head off mine," Renly said. "Be fair with your contempt. Stannis would kill Cersei's children as quickly as he would kill any of us, because he thinks law is a girl to be had and not a wife to be cherished. Robert will do nothing like a man who has drunk too much and swears he will run tomorrow." He stopped, anger evaporating into a kind of haste. "Come with me now. We take the boy, Tommen, and the girl, Myrcella, and we seal the Red Keep. The city will follow whomever holds children in one hand and bread in the other. By sunset, the tale will be told the way we need it to be told, not the way she wants it told. If I had wanted to take children from a mother, Ned said, I would have stayed in the South when I learned to hate it. Renly's eyes hardened. Then you will lose them, he said. And for the first time Ned heard in him the steel that people who loved him pretended they did not hear. You will lose everything you came here with, and what little respect I had for your northern pride will be another thing buried in the mud under the hooves of our horses. He left before Ned could answer. That same morning, Jaime Lannister rode with a cluster of crimson cloaks like a comet's tail. His hair caught the sun, and his smile caught the insult his sister had lived on all night. He did not love his nephew. He loved the shape of their life, and hatred had distorted that shape the way too much heat warps would. He found Jory Castle in the street near a fishmonger's stall, where the smell of brine and yesterday's catch had melted into something sour. Words were said. Jaime made them pleasant. Jory's hand stayed near his hilt out of habit rather than threat. There are some mornings when all the decisions have already been made by other people while you slept, and you come awake to find yourself inside the answer to a question you did not hear. Jaime drew without anger. It felt good because it felt clean, the way sin sometimes does, which is why people pretend sin is always dirty. The city closed around the moment like a fist. When it opened again, Jory was a body and the fishmonger's wife was screaming. Ned's leg would be cut beneath him before the day ended, and the story would be that the Lannisters had sent a message, and the small truth that Jaime had simply not known where else to put his grief would be a thing only he knew. Under burlap and barley and the slow turning of wagon wheels, Arya learned what fear does after it has had its way with you. In the first long hours, it ran in her blood like a fever and made her so light she thought she might float up through the sacks and be seen and speared like a carp under clear ice. After that, it settled in her bones and made everything heavy. Her breath, her eyelids, the thought of moving. In the third way fear comes, it crowded out even the memory of fear and made room for hunger. Yoren lifted the cover when the sun was high enough to make prayers sweat from everyone's lips. 2 bites, he said, putting a heel of bread into her hand. 3 swallows, then back like a mouse. She ate. The crumbs scratched and were sweet. She did not ask questions because asking meant being answered, and answers made noise in the world. The wagon rocked as if at sea. If she closed her eyes, Winterfell rose beneath her, pine dark and cold blue in its shadows. Some things she had not valued became precious because they could not touch her here. Bran running along the battlements, his mouth red from stolen berries. Septa Mordain scolding but forgetting halfway through and smiling a little. Robb and Jon arguing about the names for swordcuts as if names were the meat of them and not a way to keep boys quiet. She clutched the picture of her father at the weirwood in winter until her hand cramped. By evening, they had grouped themselves into a little caravan. Arya peered from under the burlap and saw a heavy boy with a bull's head shaved into his hair who looked at the world with bold distrust. A small older man with a boxmaker's hands and a nervous habit of counting barrels with his eyes. 2 thin boys who moved like shadows and whose blue tattoos had faded to ghosts. Yoren kept a steady pace, neither too slow to draw attention nor too quick to invite suspicion. The city's walls unrolled behind them. The river had changed color, and reeds whispered. In King's Landing the king rose with a hangover and sat with the small council as if it were an enemy he had to stare down. Pycelle's voice droned like a bee made fat on sweet herbs. Varys' sighs added little breezes to a room that had no window. Littlefinger bent over a parchment and made fewer notes than he would later claim. Cersei sat in a chair that looked like a throne if you were stupid and a stool if you were not. Tommen cried until his nurse took him away and brought him back again. Myrcella's face had closed in on itself like a flower that had decided to be fruit. Stark's girl is gone, Slynt reported. We have every gate sealed and searched. I will pull the city apart if it pleases your grace. Robert's eyes slid to Ned. He looked tired and mean both. Is it your girl? He asked without preamble. Tell me the truth, Ned. I've little enough of that in this damned snake pit. I do not know, Ned said. If it is, the city will not hold her for you. Not now. You talk as if I mean to put her on a spike. Robert scrubbed a hand over his face. The look he gave Cersei was hate braided with fear. Christ, I can hear you thinking, woman. I do not need to think out loud to know what is true, Cersei said. A wolf bit my son. I will have its head. Her voice softened, and even her softness cut. Or, at the least, the head of the wolf it sired. You'll do nothing without my leave, Robert snapped. 7 hells. I will have no more killing of little girls to cure your pride. The room's breath went still. Ned watched Cersei watch her husband and measured the distance between them, a distance that could not be crossed and would not be. He thought of telling Robert this day what he had learned yesterday. The thing about seed and strong stock and black hair repeating itself like a vow from father to son to bastard in all the city's alleys. He thought of Joffrey dead and some strange reprieve offered to a world that had not asked for it. He thought of Stannis measuring the wall of law between himself and a crown and finding it on his side. He almost spoke. Baelish spoke instead. It is not whether the girl did it, he said in that voice that made mockery sound like wisdom and wisdom like expense. It is whether the story says she did. The commons will believe what fills their bellies and gives them a villain they can roast in words when the meat runs out. The House of Stark has never made a habit of filling bellies down here. It may be prudent to borrow a page from Lord Varys's book and tell a tale before it is told for us. Varys lowered his lashes. My book has many pages, and your book never has the one you need when you need it, Robert said. His laughter was exhausted. Enough. Find the girl, Janos. Find her and keep her safe if she's safe. If she did this, he looked again at Ned. If she did this, we will speak again, you and I. They did not speak again before he went hunting. Lancel filled his cup too often because Lancel had been told to and because Lancel was stupid. Renly left in the night, Loras and a flock of bright men with him. Anger turned into departure because he knew no other way to shape it. Stannis did not arrive. He would not arrive for many days because the sea did not rush for any man, and because he was a man who would rather lose properly than win badly. Sansa became a hostage in all but name. The queen visited her and stroked her hair and told her she was brave. People who told you that you were brave had put you in a place where you would need to be. Sansa learned to make her face into something that would not break. At night, when she was alone, she thought of Arya and tried to write her as a story with a good ending. If Arya had killed Joffrey, she would have done it because of the butcher's boy. Sansa had told herself 100 times that the boy had been a mistake, that ladies did not think of such things, but she could not unsee how red the water had been. She might have loved Joffrey. She might have loved what she had been told to love. Now love lay like a torn banner in her lap, and she could not fold it back into something fit to wear. Sandor came sometimes to stand in her door. He did not ask to be admitted. He did not comfort her. He told her truth in a voice like gravel poured through calloused hands. You think he was a prince, he said once, uninvited. He was a boy who liked hurting smaller boys. One day he would have been king. Those two things are not the same, little bird. She hated him then the way she had hated Arya when they were small and Arya would pour ink on her embroidery and pretend it was an accident. And like with Arya, the hate had love wrapped up inside it. Though in Sandor's case there were knives in that love and it cut her even as it warmed her. Outside, the city began to talk to itself the way frightened cities do, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in howls. The taverns found a rhythm for the telling. First the golden boy fell like a doll, then the queen wept, then the king swore. Some versions had a shadow with a northern accent. Some had a little man slipping under a curtain, half goblin, half fish. Some had the hound grinning as he did the work himself. People told the version that made them feel least at the mercy of the next day. Yoren's wagons slept 2 nights in a hedgerow where the ground dipped and you could not see the road from within it. On the 3rd, they took a track that smelt of willows and old water. By then Arya had seen Gendry without knowing his name and had decided she did not like the way he looked at the world, as if the world had cheated him and he meant to return the favor. Where are we going? She asked finally, breaking the rule not to make words in the open. Yoren spat and considered a beetle that had blundered onto his boot. North, he said, unless someone drops a mountain on the road. He did not ask her name. He called her boy when he had to call her anything. He put her to the work he put the others to, fetching water, scraping the worst of the mud from the wheels with a stick when it clotted like bad thoughts, mending a broken strap with a strip of her shirt. The work made her hands raw and her mind blessedly blank. At night, when the dark came animal close, she lay awake and listened to the breathing of the men around her and measures of time that had nothing to do with bells. Once an owl called. Once, something bigger than an owl moved near the edge of their camp, and the silence put its hand over every mouth and held it until the thing went away. "You've got something in your face," Gendry said on the fourth day, staring at her without kindness or malice, simply because he liked the puzzle of the way she held herself. "You're not like the others." "I've got a nose," Arya said. "So do you." Gendry snorted. You've got a temper too. That's good. It'll keep you warm when the Night's Watch pins you in black and forgets your name." "I'm not going to the wall." She said it like a vow because she still knew what vows were and why they mattered. "Everyone goes somewhere," Gendry said. "Not many of us get to choose." He moved off to ask Yoren a question and came back with a shrug like a shield. War arrived not like a trumpet but like a rot that had already begun. And the first sign of it was a village where there had been one last season and ashes where that village had been. The ashes had been rained on and turned to paste. The wind took a taste of it and carried it to them, sour and old. There were bones in the paste. Yoren looked a long time and said nothing, and the boys learned something about him then that he did not teach with his voice. They learned how to go very carefully, and they learned to look for tracks that were not made by deer. At the ford, where the river ran shallow over stones that had worn themselves round with patience, Arya knelt and let the cold take her fingers until they hurt. She did not cry. She said names under her breath, the way a woman pricks cloth with a needle, and each prick is both wound and necessary step. Joffrey's was no longer there. It had fallen away like scab after new skin comes. That frightened her a little. She was not ready to give up punishment as a way to keep people alive in her mind after they had gone. But the list rearranged itself whether she liked it or not. The hound stayed. The queen grew heavier. Island Pain glinted like the edge of a coin. A new name floated, uncertain. Baelish. She had seen his eyes on her father as men talked about which wolves were allowed to bite. Word came to them as word comes to those who do not ask. Half-true and whole horrific. The king had been gored. He would live. He would die. He had died and named his friend Regent. He had choked on wine and would sit up laughing any minute now. He was already buried and Stannis was already at the gate. Yoren nodded to each storytelling and boiled whatever meat he had down into a broth that tasted the same for good news as it did for bad. "Keep walking," he told the boys. "I don't care if the king comes down the road riding a pig. Keep walking." Ned Stark learned to stand and sit like a man with a broken bit of himself. The wound Jaime's men had given him made the stairs of the Red Keep a mountain. He climbed because he had to, and the pain made his mind clear in the way pain sometimes does. When the king sent for him, Ned went and found a man who had been a better king when he was too poor to own a shirt than he was now in his ermine and gold. Robert's eyes were jaundiced with drink and fury and something more hollow. "I named you Regent," Robert said. "They made me write Stannis. I wrote your name over it when she left the room." "Ah." He grinned then and winced. "That'll salt her." "The truth is a simpler salt," Ned said. He laid the book down. A leather weight thumped on wood. "They are not your children." Robert closed his eyes. For a long moment it looked like rest had finally found him in the cradle of his pain. Then his hand snaked out and hit the book hard, as if to dislodge it from the world and not the table. "Gods curse you, you old crook. Why could you never keep your mouth shut when a man might have liked it? I have kept it shut too long already." Ned felt the room shrink to the space between them, and the felted whisper of the guards outside became the only clock. "Joffrey's death does not fix this. It makes it worse. It means there is still time to save the realm. For Tommen, for Myrcella, they are not to blame for what their mother did." "Oh," Robert said, and his voice turned soft with lethal fondness. "They will be. The realm will blame them until it finds someone more to blame. That is how the realm keeps itself warm on winter nights." He breathed out a laugh. "Stannis will hang them with law. Renly will put flowers on their graves. I will do nothing and then die. It is what I do best." "You can do this thing," Ned said. "You can name a Lord Protector with your seal and have the watch stand too. You can keep order until Stannis comes. You can demand that Cersei leave the city with the children now, safe under oath. You think I have ever held her under anything but my fist?" Robert's eyes opened. "And you think I did that well?" He held Ned's gaze until both men were younger in their own memories, then let it go. "Do what you will, Ned. Do what you always do. Make the right choice and see everyone you love pay for it. We were made for that, you and I." He died 3 days later. The boar had made a mess of him, and pain had combed him into a good shape for dying. Cersei took pity on him as much as she envied him for leaving first. She kissed his forehead and spoke to the maester in a tone that had lifted ladles and swords both. When the seal was broken and the parchment found, the name written over Stannis's was inked square and black. Baelish smiled when he saw it. Varys sighed. Pycelle prated about the letter of the law until the law grew bored and left the room. Ned called the gold cloaks and was betrayed by them because men whose loyalty is bought will always sell it again if offered a better price. In another world, in another telling, he might have died there on the steps with his girl screaming and his head held up for the city to see, because a boy with a crown had thought a headsman's work a good trick to learn. In this world, the boy who would have made that call was dead, and Cersei was clever. Ned was thrown in a cell and not killed. Sansa became a bird in a gilded cage and not a one-handed widow. A letter was sent north to a lady who had waited too long to learn resignation. On the road, Arya came to love mornings because they were the time when anything might be true. The day had not yet hardened around its rottenness. She could imagine walking and walking until she found a tree she remembered, and a door in it, and her father inside. The road did not care for her imagining. It pushed them where it pushed everyone, toward the places where men with armor gathered and the little places that had nothing left to eat. They came upon a hamlet burned to the ground and found a woman cooking something in a pot over a fire that should not have been able to burn. The smell was the smell of hunger given up on pride. Arya gave her a slice of hard cheese from a pouch Yoren did not quite know she had taken and felt ashamed to see the woman's hands tremble with gratitude. "They came with lions on their chests," the woman said, when the cheese had been swallowed. "They laughed like boys and burned like old men. We ran to the river and the river was in on it too." "Who?" Gendry demanded, as if getting the name would change the shape of the grief. "Men," the woman said, and Arya wondered if that was a wisdom older than houses. When they reached the crossroads, Catelyn Stark had already passed by another road, dragging a captive Tyrion Lannister behind her like an argument she did not have time to finish. In the Riverlands, Riverrun had begun to listen for its son and found instead the thud of horse hooves. Robb called bannermen and came south a boy and would be a king or a corpse or something in between no one had a word for. Tywin Lannister lit his slow fires and set his careful snares. He did not think of Arya Stark, he did not have to. He thought of Ned in a cell and Sansa in a room that got smaller every day. He thought of Jaime, and the way his son laughed when he was hot with shame and proud both. He played the only game he knew and did not make jokes about how cheap men's lives were because he did not joke. It is one thing to begin a war because you must and another to continue it when you see its face. Arya saw it when a boy fell under the wheel of their own wagon and screamed until he did not. Yoren did what mercy demanded. Arya watched, and the sound the boy made when the knife went in joined the list in her head and found a place there for when she needed to remember what sword work meant. Gendry stared hard at the ground until the ground gave up and let him not cry. "It will not stop," Yoren said that night, not to comfort, because comfort is a lie that makes men soft, and not to hurt, because he was not cruel for sport. "It will not stop until what is hot has burned down and what is green has gone brown, and some lord decides his children are safe enough to marry. By then we'll be cold and old if we're lucky." "Luck?" Gendry scoffed, because he did not yet know what luck was. "That's for rich men. Poor men have work." "Work?" Yoren said, and spat and went to sleep. In the city, Sansa learned to sing for the queen and to not flinch when a man's head became a parable someone else told to keep her meek. She learned that Tommen was a kind boy and that kindness could be used as easily as cruelty when someone clever wanted what lay in a kind boy's power to give. She learned the shape of Varys's kindness and the smell of Baelish's. She kept a small piece of lemon peel in her pocket to smell when she needed to be a girl again for half a heartbeat. Sandor found her once with the peel in her hand and took it without a word. She thought he might eat it. He did not. He threw it out the window. "It will make you soft," he said. She hated him for hours after and then liked him more than she liked herself for being able to forgive him for telling a truth in a cruel way. Ned dreamed of snow in the black mold of his cell. Names became stone. Stones became names. He refused food one day in grief and found that his strength left him faster than he would have believed possible. After that, he ate because eating was another way to fight. Varys came and brought him a false dawn in his voice. "She wants you alive while she chooses the shape of your death," Varys said suavely. "She is not a fool. She knows how numbers work, and you are a large number in a small room." Ned closed his eyes. He saw a girl with a sword and a boy with a handful of snow. He had sent his girls south to learn what ladies learn. It was the worst thing he had done in a life that had taught him to count worse things. "Arya," he said. "A name I can help with," Varys said. He could not, of course, not in any way that would make Ned more alive than he was. But it soothed the man who would not break and did not bend, to hear the promise that someone knew how to find a small wolf in a very big wood. Varys smoothed his robe. "Your elder child will live if you let her. The queen would like a confession, a civilized one. A lie." Ned saw the shape of it immediately and loathed his skill. If he said what they wanted, he would give something large away and he would not even own the giving, because no one would have the decency to admit he had paid for his child's breath with his honor. "If I confess," he said, "I do not get to choose the next lie they tell." "No one does," Varys said. "Some men mistake their crowns for the right to. They are the saddest fools of all." North of where Catelyn had taken Tyrion and south of where Robb would make a king of himself, Arya woke one night to hear singing. It was not good singing. It sounded more like the way men talk when they are drunk and trying to be tender in a world that has taught them there is no place for tenderness. She crept toward it because crept is how she did everything now, with a calculus of breath and shadow. Gendry followed her, because he was too proud to let her go and too smart to let her go alone. A handful of men knelt before a fire, passing a cup like the small heart of a woman between them. Their cloaks were a mixture of the rags of houses that had been grand once and the humble patches of none. One had a sigil that made Arya's breath catch, though she did not yet have a name to put to that catch. A lightning bolt, faded to ghost. They were praying for the boy who had died under the wheel. They prayed as if prayer were work and not a trick. When they were done, one of them looked up and saw Arya and Gendry and did not draw his sword. "Join us," he said. "We've nothing but bread and lies to share." They sat and learned one version of the war, that it belonged not to lords but to the men who had to live in it with no titles to cushion the fall. Later, that man would call himself Beric Dondarrion with a grim humor that would teach Arya more about loss than 100 dead towns had. Later, she would learn a priest's flame was not always the fire that burned a witch's name out of a book. For now, she learned men could be brave in ways that did not require banners. And always like a drum in the mud, the question rolled. What had she done? It was not remorse. She did not grieve Joffrey. She grieved the child in her who had believed that putting a sword into the soft under a boy's arm would end something and not begin 100 other things in which her family might be broken. She had struck at a line, not a man, and the line had flinched and snapped back. Gendry did not ask, because he did not need the answer to tell him who she was. Yoren did not ask, because in the north there is a silence made to contain a truth until it becomes a shield. When they stopped by a stream and washed the dust off their faces, Arya found she had gotten older without growing tall. When she practiced at night with a stick, she felt that her old dances had been children's songs. The new ones had knives in them. Whispering would become a place in the mouths of men that tasted like victory. Robb's wolves had howled and Jaime Lannister had fallen like a gilt toy behind a curtain. Arya heard it said by a tinker with a broken wheel that the young wolf had eyes like the father's and a mother who had thrown propriety into the river like a stone. And both those things had made them win. Tywin moved his men like a man who never makes two mistakes in a row, and the tale twisted to accommodate him, as tales do around men with so much patience they seem inevitable. Riverrun opened its arms and its mouths. Letters went out. One did not find Arya. It did not need to. She dreamed of her mother and woke with blood in her mouth because she had bit her own cheek hard to keep from making a noise in the dark. Cersei stood on the balcony of a tower that pretended to have moral authority because of how old it was and the number of times men had put important papers inside it. She listened to Pycelle drone about ways execution might be made civil. Tommen hugged a kitten and did not know why people kept crying around him. He was not old enough, and it would make him strange later when he was. Sansa stood near the edge of a rug and told herself not to move because moving would make her tremble. Sandor leaned in the doorway, watchful, already halfway gone from this life and not knowing, as some men are halfway gone from a banquet before the table is set. "We will trade," Cersei said, and the python of grief that lived in her voice gave the word a thrall's obedience. "The Kingslayer for the wolf. Westeros is a market like any other." "We will trade," Varys soothed. "If there is someone to trade with, the Lady Catelyn is at Riverrun. The boy king, Robb, is energetic. And the other girl?" Cersei smiled without humor. "The little one who vanished when she was needed? She is a story some fools tell to frighten their daughters from making faces at princes." Sansa exhaled a breath she had not intended to hold. She lowered her eyes and saw her hands. They did not shake. That felt like the first true thing she had learned in months. That sometimes the body obeys when the heart does not, and you can thank it later if later comes. Later would come in the shape of a letter with a ragged seal and a man's blood on the fold. It would say that a father could live if he learned to lie about himself and if his daughter learned to love the man who held the words like he owned them. It would not say that men who lie for love become exactly like those who lie for power and hate, to those who watch only results. It would not say that any man's survival is bought with the death of some part of him. It would say only, "Come, say the thing, kneel and live." Ned knelt. He said the thing. He lived, for a time, in a cell, a different kind of death. In another story, he would have died that day on the steps, and a girl would have watched the blade fall and something in her would have turned an instrument made for only one song. In this story, she had already killed and the blade did not fall on the steps because the boy who would have demanded it had been stopped by a slender sword at the tender place beneath a prince's arm. The city learned something about fairness it had suspected all along. That it does not exist and that when it does it is an accident no one intended. Robb Stark sent and took and bled, because that is how boys become kings and kings become stories. He did not know that his sister had made a choice, and that choice had made his crown less certain by making one of his bargaining pieces shakier, and one of his hated enemies less able to make the mistake that would have burned their house into a kiln. He sent men to parley and others to die, and the numbers of them slid around in Catelyn's head like stones in a bag. She held Jaime's chain and heard the clank of it in her dreams, and woke to find it was her own heart. Arya learned to cut her hair without crying, and to sew a wound clumsily shut on a boy's arm, and to bury someone and not come apart. Yoren died the way good men die. Too soon, doing the thing they said they would, and not enough people remembering them properly later. The wagon broke and the road broke and the fellowship broke in the way fellowships do when food runs out and fear runs in. And Arya stood up in what was left and did not wait for anyone to tell her where to go. She went toward home because she was a Stark, and that was what you did even when you were not sure where home was anymore. The Hound left the city on a night that tasted of copper. He had lost a prince and found something he could not name. He would find it later, in a girl who had made herself into an answer he hated and wanted. For now, he took a horse and a purse and a sword and the heat that had burned him long ago and walked into a road that did not care if he lived or died. He told himself he did not care either. He lied only a little. Sansa grew quieter. People mistook it for sweetness, and they were sometimes rewarded because she had learned to distill herself into what she needed to be to endure. Baelish spoke with her, and she made her face into something that did not cringe. Varys spoke, and she made it into something that did not hope too easily. Tommen gave her a kitten, and she learned to keep something alive that needed her. It was not a large skill for a highborn girl to learn, and it would be everything later. The war continued the way wars continue, by habit, by appetite, by accident. Men told each other it had reasons and then believed their own telling. Letters went astray. Kings sat up at 3 in the morning and stared at candles as if flame had answers. Queens stood on balconies in dresses heavy enough to break their backs and looked down at streets that once were just places to buy bread and now were battlegrounds for people who would never step foot in them. Maesters recorded everything they were allowed to see and drew pictures of everything else with ink that had, at some point, been made of boiled oak and iron and gall and sometimes human tears. Arya crossed a river with a stick and a stubborn boy and a man who would, in another year, become a priest of a god he had not yet decided on and did not yet know he did not believe in. She told herself she could still feel needle a long time after she had lost it, in her palm, in the tendons of her wrist, in the way her body leaned slightly forward even standing still. She did not forget Joffrey. She did not give him more space in her head than he deserved. She did not forgive herself for the things that came after, because forgiveness is something lazy people give themselves when they get tired of doing the hard work of behaving better. When at last she came upon a hill where the wind took the sound of her name and brought it back to her with the smell of pines in it, she let herself sit. She did not pray. She did not sing. She breathed. The grass hissed. Somewhere far to the south, Sansa fed a kitten and thought about the sound Arya had made when she laughed before anyone had told her what a lady is. Somewhere east, a man with a scar drank and did not call it grief. In a cell, Ned slept with his hand on his ribs, as if he held in a pain that would escape if he let it. In a cold room near the sea, a woman wrote a letter and sealed it with wax and did not know if it would cross any river. The war rolled on toward a hall full of candles and a song that would be called the worst kind of wedding, and toward long winters and short rains and clever men and stupid men dying in equal measure for ideas they half understood. At the tourney of the hand, 1,000 ghosts lingered. There was the boy with the red wine in his hair, who had died twice, once by the river and once when a girl remembered him. There was the prince who had not lived long enough to become the king he might have been, for good or for ill. There was a girl with a cat's grace slipping under a curtain. There was a man with a face like burn scar who caught a lady as she fell. Some ghosts stay because they want justice, some because they want revenge, some because they do not know how to leave. The tourney grounds had become other things since, trampled by other boots, crushed under other orders. But if you stood on a certain plank at a certain hour and breathed in, you could smell pine oil and wax and the faintest memory of lemon cakes. And if you put your finger into a narrow slit in the carved back of a chair and closed your eyes, you might feel, or imagine you felt, the edge of something small and pointy slide past your skin and into the soft place where a boy's breath had once lived. Arya walked on. The road did not end. It bent and bent again the way lives do. She would come to inns and leave them and forget all but the one that mattered. She would lose and find and lose again the people who told her who she was. She would keep a list and learn what lists can and cannot do. In the summers of her memory, the air in the north would be full of gnats and the sound of water going where it meant to go, and her father's hand would rest on her shoulder like a promise half kept. In winters, she would sharpen steel with breath that made little clouds and tell herself stories of girls who cut through knots other people found impossible. None of those stories would begin at a tourney, but one of them would. All of them would end with a girl standing up again and choosing in a world that wanted to do the choosing for her. The world does not stop for a single stroke of a small sword, however true the thrust. It shudders and swallows the sound and continues. The beauty and the horror of it is that sometimes the sound it swallows becomes a drumbeat far away, and what was once a little girl's act of vengeance becomes the measure by which men march. And still, somewhere on a hill between here and home, a girl would cut her bread carefully, and remember to keep her hands where her father could see them, even when he was not there, and look at the road below and decide to walk it, because no one else could do that for her and because she had chosen to be the kind of person who did. At dawn the mist was low along the hedgerows, torn in pale skeins by the passage of the carts and the boots of boys who were trying to stamp their fear down into the hard road. Arya kept to the right side of the wagon where the ruts were shallowest and the willows leaned close enough for their leaves to brush her knuckles like small secret hands. Gendry tramped a little ahead, the bull's head shaved and his hair grown into a dark fuzz that made him look, to her eye, more stubborn than fierce. Yoren's absence walked with them, as if he were a tall, thin shadow always at the edge of sight. Sometimes she almost turned to tell him something sharp, because it was in her to say the sharp thing first and the true thing later, and then she remembered that the world had swallowed him as greedily as it swallowed wine. They came to the crossroads in where the king had once eaten a meal and laughed with his friend and sworn oaths as easily as a man swears he will never drink again. Now it smelled of damp and fear and old grease. The yard held a handful of horses with their heads low, ribs showing, flies the only creatures bold enough to make any sound at all. A man in a patched green cloak sat on a fallen post tuning a lute with fingers that had more nimbleness in them than hope. Near him a younger man with a lemon-colored cloak too bright for the day's gray fiddled with the stringing of a bow, jaw working on something that might have been a piece of leather or a thought. Arya would have passed them both like she passed any men she had not decided to notice if the man who came around the corner of the stable had not been a memory set walking. He was taller than she remembered because she had been smaller then, and his hair had gone from brown to a muddy sort of chestnut, but his eyes were the same, kind and sharp and a little surprised, as if he had not expected the world to be as loud as it was and loved it in spite of that. "Underfoot," Harwin said, and stopped dead. The word fell out of him like a knife dropped from a tired hand. She heard the name as if it had traveled down a long corridor to find her. She did not run to him because she had learned some things about not running, and because part of her wanted to turn and vanish into the willows with the secret of still being Arya Stark held tight where no one could grab it. She walked to him, and he did the respectful thing a man does before a lord's daughter, and then ruined it by putting both hands on her shoulders and looking down into her face as if the world had come back from some terrible mistake. "Harwin," she said. The word tasted of winter and horsehair and the cold iron of bits between teeth. "How did you get here?" "Rode," he said, which made the lute player laugh softly, as if laughs were currency and the man had learned to spend them carefully. "And walked a piece when riding was a sort of walking, and ran when fire taught us running was more sensible than pride. There's a whole choir of us now, He stopped, swallowed the title, and began again. "There's a whole choir of us with more songs than voices. Come and hear one." He took her to the fallen tree where the bright-cloaked archer sat, and the lute had given up its stubbornness and become music. The man in lemon threw her a grin that was all teeth and mischief, and the lute man. Tom, he said his name was, and he did not bother to add the rest because men who call themselves by a single name either have nothing else or have everything else and want to see what you think, sang a verse about a lord who had lost his courage while looking for it under his bed. It was not a good song, or rather it was not sung well, but it made the day feel like it had a roof over it, and Arya felt her shoulders unclench without her permission. "Where are you taking this lot?" Harwin asked Yoren's second, who had become Yoren's first because death makes promotions swifter than merit. The man, Rudge or Ruggin, he was not consistent when asked, shrugged with a weariness that could have been wisdom. "North," he said, "always north." Harwin's gaze flicked to Arya and back, and his face did a very small complicated thing that was not quite a smile. "There's north and north," he said. "The one that makes sense and the one that does not. We could do with another pair of hands, if the lad here wants work." He made the last word large enough to hold loyalty and safety without promising either. "He's not a lad," Gendry said, blunt as a smith's hammers. Tom laughed again, and Lemoncloak stopped chewing his strip of leather and spat it out. "She's exactly a lad until she's not," Lem said, and wagged the bowstring at Gendry. "You'll live longer if you learn to see what's under the clothes and not let on about it." Harwin took Arya aside where the stable wall's shadows were thick and the hay smell drowned the stink of old fat. "We have a place we go," he said, "a hill with a hollow in it, and a fire that does not give us away. We keep to the hollows and the hedges and the old lanes where the Romans piled their stones when they still remembered how to do that. Come there, come there, Arya. You'll find people who will call you by your whole name, and a man who says justice as if the word were a whetstone." She thought of names. She thought of the ones she kept like coins in a purse no one else got to touch. She thought of the way some names got too heavy and fell out of the purse of their own accord. "We have to keep walking," she said, because she did not know what else to say that would not be a plea. "Walk with us," Harwin said. "It is the same road. We just have more company and more songs and more arrows in the hedges for when company turns sour." They fell in together as if they had always meant to meet there. Ruggin grumbled and tried to cow the bright men with talk of the night's watch and duty, and how the road north ate boys and spat out bones with black cloaks on them. And Lem answered him with a story about the time he had been a squire to a man so pious, he had forgotten how to take his boots off without a prayer and had to ask the seven for aid in all matters of leather. Angwy. So the lemon-cloaked archer named himself when Tom called him a show-off, shot a leaf off a branch just to make a point about what might happen to men who followed them with ill intent. Gendry sniffed. "My master could shoot better," he said, which was the sort of thing boys say when they have not learned yet that you can admire and be loyal in the same breath. Angwy took it with the good grace of a man who liked annoyance as seasoning for his stew. They reached the hollow hill at twilight, and the fire lit inside it was a small sun that had learned humility. Men moved there the way men move in a place that has asked for quiet and gotten it. The scuff of heel, the low murmur, the jingle of a bit as a horse shook its head in a dream. Thuras of Myr came out of the glow like something summoned. Bald as an old weathered egg, beard shot through with gray and grease, eyes soft and clever and tired. He looked at Arya and then past her, and the kind eyes sharpened without hardening, the way a man's eyes do when he is looking at two different things and seeing both in their whole shape. "You've brought her home," he told Harwin, and then to Arya, as if explaining a magic he did not mean to own. "Beric will want to see you. He has a thing about Starks. It's the North in him. The dead like you better, where you're from." The Hollow's heart was a chamber cut out of roots and earth, the walls oozing a clean damp that smelled of life trying to retreat and failing at it. Beric Dondarrion sat with his back against a pillar of root as thick as a man, his head bowed. When he looked up, Arya saw the holes in him, the places where life had been and left and left again, and how this had not made him cruel, only thinner. There was a softness about his mouth that should have belonged to a younger man, which made the scars around it stand out more fiercely. "Lady Arya," he said, and stood. He could not make the motion smooth. Something snagged where ribs had grown wrong. "Forgive the place. My halls are not what they were." She felt the desire to say some proud thing, some nothing that would make her sound older and unafraid. She swallowed it because there were men in this place who had died and gotten back up and had decided to keep walking anyway. "If you call me lady again," she said, "I'll pull your hair like I used to pull my sister's." He laughed as if it did not hurt, and then it did hurt, and he swallowed it and made a motion that might have been a bow. "Arya, then, we keep a rough court here. Names are boons and tools both. We like to keep them oiled." They fed her stew that had too much onion in it and not enough meat, and she would have wept with gratitude if she had not learned a little better than that. Thuras asked her careful questions about roads and rumors, and Tom asked careless questions about songs. And Lem did not ask anything because he had already slotted her into the world he kept in his head. When the questions curved around and found the thing they had always meant to find, the hollow got quieter of its own accord. Angwy had said something sharp to Gendry about forging arrowheads that bent when they should not, and Harwin had laughed, and then Tom said, because he was the sort who would rather pull a thorn out than pretend it was not there, "There's a talk in the inns now about a prince who fell at a tourney like a rag doll, and a whisper about a shadow quick as a little knife behind him." Tom had pity in him under the jest, and he brought it out when he needed it. That shadow had the shape of a wolf if you listened the right way. Arya did not look away. She had learned that looking away gave men room to come closer. She said, "It was not a shadow." Thuras's mouth moved around a prayer and did not finish it. Beric set his bowl down and shaped his hands as if around a hilt. "Tell me what it was," he said. "A list," Arya said, "and a song." Jon's voice, and Sirio's, and her own braided. She did not describe how the wood smelled or how much the silk bled. She did not need to. These men lived in a world where small precise actions have very large loud consequences. They could fill the silences with the right colors. Beric did not rebuke her, and he did not praise her. He nodded once, as if a truth had been set in a row with other truths and would make a better fence for it. "We will keep you a little while," he said, "until the road ahead is less crowded with men who would like to hang you to quiet their wives and their sleep. We have a web of men and hedgerows both. And we have a few favors left to cash with lords who remember why we were raised up in the first place." "Raised up," Thuras said dryly. "Thrown down, raised up again. It makes a man devout, all that lifting." They gave her a bed of old hay and new cloth and the space to breathe. Gendry muttered something about sleeping with a smith's hammer under his head and did. Lem snored and denied it when Tom told him about it in the morning. Harwin sat a watch with 3 others and looked out into trees that held their breath. When the dawn came, it came like a secret told quietly. The sky a pale blue rumor, the birds slow to commit themselves. The first rider brought word of a Lannister convoy on the east road. 5 gold cloaks, 8 men in crimson and lion, 2 wagons, and a small passo of a priest who was either very brave or very stupid. The second rider brought the more important part, panting like a dog and laughing without mirth. "There's a caged raven in the back wagon," he said, "and a man who looks like a story." Arya felt the skin on her arms pebble. "What sort of story?" "The sort grandfathers tell with a cup and a hearth," the man said. "Black hair gone to iron filings. A face that looks like it would be colder if he weren't in a cage." Harwin was already standing. He did not look at her when he said, "Beric." "We take them where the oaks reach over," Beric said. "We give them the chance to lay down their swords and pick up their good sense. When they don't, we keep the swords and bury the sense. Thuras, you'll do your trick with the fire and the courage. Lem, you'll make yourself impossibly loud. Angui, you'll drop the first 3 men who think they need to make a point." "And the man in the wagon?" Tom asked, a gentleness hidden in the question like a needle under moss. "We will see what sort of story he is," Beric said. They moved as they had done a dozen times and more, with ease born of repetition and a little fear to keep the edge bright. Arya went where Harwin put her, the low dip beside a stump where the road curved toward a stand of oaks that let their limbs drape like gossiping ladies. She had her stick and a knife she had sharpened until it was certain of its own mind. Gendry had a smith's hammer that belonged on iron rather than heads, and a look that said he knew this and did not mind. They heard the convoy before they saw it. The rattle of harness, the creak of wheels that needed grease, a man's complaint about flea bites, another man's complaint about that man's complaint. Angui's first arrow made a sound like a struck note and became an inch of feather sprouting out of a red cloak's neck. The man folded with surprising grace. Thuras vaulted into the road like a mad dog of a priest, his robe flaring, a torch in one hand. Lem came from the other side bellowing, "Throw down, you sheep fondlers, and live long enough to make better choices than these." Some did, hands flying up, swords falling with the clatter and regret of a bad wager. Some did not and met bad luck quickly. Harwin was there with a calm that made the air around him quieter. He did the necessary things with his sword like a man cutting bread he meant to share. Arya let a boy who looked younger than she was run past her and clipped him clean on the temple with her stick because his eyes had the rolling white of a horse, and men with eyes like that do worse things than men who can see what they are doing. He fell and she did not kick him because she had a father once who watched her and would have raised an eyebrow at that. The back wagon had an iron grill and a lock the size of her fist. Tom had it open before Lem had finished his second insult. Inside, manacles had made a meal of a man's wrists. He sat with his knees drawn up, one ankle bound to a ring in the wood. His beard had gone wild and his eyes had gone inward as if to find a place to stand when the world kept tilting. He raised his head when the light changed. The face was a map she had memorized without knowing she had. Lines for laughter in the wrong places because laughter had not had enough chances to make them properly. The mouth set like a door well-oiled and carefully closed. The eyes gray and the kind of steady that had kept 1,000 things from breaking before she was born. Her breath left her. It ran out of her as if a door had opened in her ribs and the air had been waiting. "Father," she said, and forgot how to be anyone but the child who had run underfoot and made trouble in the kennels and put snow in Bran's bed and lied about it badly. Eddard Stark had learned in the black cell how to move slowly and make it look like dignity. He did it now because everything in him wanted not to, and he was a man who could argue with himself and win. "Arya," he said. He said it as if he were moving a chess piece he had been sure he would never touch again. "You've grown." She laughed, an ugly, helpless sound, and then made it quiet because habits are armor. Harwin had his head bent and his mouth tilted because he had wanted a forgiveness like this for months and had only asked the gods for sleep. "Get the irons," he said, and Lem did, and Arya's fingers were on the steel before anyone could tell her not to. She worked the cuff open with a stubbornness that was almost prayer and not a little knowledge about how things go when they are made by men who care more about looking strong than being so. When he stood, he did it badly, and if he had not put his hand on her head as if to steady himself and her both, she would have given him her shoulder and forgotten she was small. He looked around and did a thing with his mouth that told her he had measured the world and found it not to be kind, which was news to no one here, and then his eyes came back to her and gentled. "We will talk," he said. "I will beg the forgiveness I have no right to ask, but first we will walk out of here alive." The men who had not thrown down had been dealt with. Thuris's torch was in the dirt, smoking like the last breath of a fire that had been too bold. Angui had his arrows back where he could, and Lem had a cut along his forearm that would be a new story and had been bandaged with cloth that had once been some lady's chemise and would be a joke later. Beric came as if he had risen from the ground and stood before Eddard Stark, and did not bow because men like him have learned to see the use of respect and not practice it for its own sake. "My Lord Stark," he said, "we don't kneel down here because there isn't room and because the roots don't like it. Will you come under the hill and let us decide what to do with you?" Ned Stark's smile was the sort a man makes at a boy who has declared he will fight a boar with a kitchen knife. "I have had enough of men deciding what to do with me," he said. "I will come, and I will give thanks where thanks are due, and then I will make my road." Harwin stood straighter than he had all day. "There is a lady who will be happy to see you try, my lord." Ned's mouth softened and grew fierce in the same moment. "I have bent too many roads under me. It will be good to walk one that goes where it should." They took him to the hollow hill by ways that had not been used by anyone with a flag in 100 years, and they fed him the same stew and poured him a cup of wine that had a mulish, belligerent taste and called itself good because no one was rude enough to say otherwise. He ate and drank and kept his inhalations shallow to hide how his ribs hurt him. Arya watched him do it as if she could solve the problem with her stare. He put his hand over hers under the cloth as if to tell her he had noticed her noticing and was grateful. Beric told him what they were. It did not take long. The many deaths did not need to be laid out like relics. The man wore them. Thuris said a word or two about his god and then shut his mouth, because he had grown into the habit of not liking the sound of his own voice when it spoke sermons. Tom sang a low song about men who keep their word even when all the clever men have stopped keeping theirs, and the melody braided itself with the hollow that Ned Stark had carried with him from King's Landing. When it was quiet again, Ned said, "There is a daughter in the city." "We know," Beric said. "We have a hawk-eyed little bird who tells us how many candles are lit in the Queen's rooms and how often the Master of Coin takes his turn in the black cells. He tells us your Sansa sings very well and that the Hound does not care for songs. He says there is a dwarf who uses words like arrows and has better aim than any man in the Red Keep can admit." Ned nodded. The dwarf would be Tyrion Lannister. He had not met the man as a host should, and he found he had enough grace left to be ashamed of that on some other day. "Cersei sent me north to take the Black," he said. "Someone else sent men to make sure I did not get there, because sometimes kings die better in cells than in snow. I would prefer snow." Thuras lifted his cup and sloshed wine on his robe. "I prefer wine to any man's preferences," he said. "Will take you as far as a certain tree that I love. It will not stop a spear, but it will confuse the men who hold it. From there, if you can find a boat on the Green Fork and a man who remembers what a Stark silver looks like, you might float to a place where Tullus remember their old debts." "Riverrun," Harwin said, not hiding his hope behind sense. "My lady, your lady." has made a habit of standing on its walls with her hands on the stone and the sort of prayer in her mouth that makes gods ashamed to be deaf. Take him there, he added, to the air, to the roots, to the godswood, wherever it was listening. Take him there and let me see something I have not seen since the frost last came early, and we all thought that meant a long good winter and not the start of wars that would never be done. They went at dawn, which was a cunning dawn masquerading as a cloudy morning, so the road would not see them in a good light. Arya walked near her father because she did not trust the space to remain filled with him if she dropped her eyes. He walked with a stick Harwin had cut for him, a simple ash with a fork at the top that fit his hand. Gendry had gone from being a boy who was not sure about any man who was not his master to a boy who would carry something heavy if Ned told him to, which he did not. Lem scouted, and Angwy scuffed leaves over their prints where the ground was soft, and Tom hummed little scraps of song very quietly, like charms for their feet. In King's Landing, Tyrion Lannister had discovered that the only thing worse than commanding people who wanted him dead was commanding people who wanted him to succeed. The first would do the obvious wickedness. The second would weep if he failed and thereby bind him to them with gratitude, which is the more dangerous chain. He had made a map of the city in his head where each alley was a thought and each gate a choice, and he spent his days moving figures on it. 10 men here, a barrel of this there, a rumor here, a lie there, until the whole board began to make a sound like a rope stretched taut. Varys brought him news wrapped in silk. Shay brought him sleeplessness wrapped in perfume. Cersei brought him rage like a gift horse whose grin told you its teeth would be in your arm before nightfall. Tommen brought him a cat once, a foolish, absurd creature that climbed his chair and bit his ear and made him laugh until the hurt of it surprised him out of it. The boy needs a Lord Protector who is not a fool, Tyrion told Bronn, who sprawled like a man who had grown up in a country where furniture was rare and learned to make any surface into something that could be sat on. He has a mother. Clever, Bronn said, and went back to cleaning his nails with his dagger tip. Stannis has ships. Renly has flowers. Tywin has me. He grinned at Tyrion's face. I mean, he has a lot of men who swing swords. You have me, and sticks of green fire you keep muttering about as if it were some brothel trick you're hoping will not go wrong. It will go wrong, Tyrion said. Everything does. The trick is to make it go wrong in a way that hurts someone else more than it hurts you. He put his finger on a point on his map. We set the chain here. We set the pots here, here, and here. We pray to any god who did not get bored and go away that the wind remembers our names. The day Stannis came up the Blackwater with his ships in a dark mouth, the wind remembered and the gods were bored in a way that suited men who had planned too much and slept not enough. The wildfire lit the river like a story told to frighten children, and the screams were operatic, and the smell was the smell of men discovering what sort of gods they had been serving when they served victory and discovered it had no loyalty to them. Tyrion led from the front because he had discovered that when you do, men will follow you against their better judgment and they will do astonishing things with axes. He went into the mud when Ser Mandon made of his oath a doorway and stepped through, and crawled out of the mud with blood on his face that would leave a new shape for his nose and a new way for his breath to sound when he slept. He laughed when he woke because he had outlived a plan, and because laughter was the only proof he had not drowned in fear. Tywin Lannister rode in with roses at his back because timing is the thing that separates a hero from a man who likes to read accounts of battles and then tell you who should have done what. Marjorie Tyrell had already sent a letter written on paper that smelled of crushed flowers, offering an alliance that was all meat and no garnish. The king, she wrote, is but a boy. He will need a queen whose family can keep the gardens from scouring to dirt. Cersei hated her from that moment because women know when other women are telling the truth and also lying at the same time. Renly died elsewhere, in a tent that thought cloth might keep out the sort of thing that killed him. The shadow slid into his body like a man sliding his hand into a glove, and when it slid out, what was left went slack and unkinged. Loras wept in a way that made people afraid to comfort him. Stannis said nothing at all about it, and Melisandre's eyes were the color of a sword pulled from a forge and not quenched. Jon Snow knew none of that when he climbed with Qhorin Halfhand on a path goats would have thought twice about. He knew only the way the air thinned and the sound his breath made and the feel of a rock in his hand that was older than any story and did not care about stories. He knew the look of Ygritte's smile when she wanted to catch him in a lie, and the way the world felt different when you did not kill a person you could kill. When a raven came with a letter that smelled of damp and fear, he held it without opening it for as long as he could, because there are things that are true whether you read them or not, and a man may be allowed one small cowardice if he does not make it a habit. When he read that his father was out of the city and going north, he put his hand on the page as if he might push the ink into the paper harder and make it more true. "My father," he said to Corin, because a man says things out loud sometimes to make them survive another breath. "The world turns," Corin said, which was the sort of unhelpful thing that is only helpful when you choose to let it be. "Keep your feet. The turn does not stop for you." In the Riverlands, the river's turn had cut a little eddy of safety where a skiff could be hidden under branches and moss and forgetfulness. Barrack's men found a man who owed a favor and remembered that it doesn't cost as much to pay one as to explain why you never will. The man's boat was low and cranky, but the river knew him and did not drown him out of impatience. Arya, Gendry, Harwin, Tom, and her father lay low as the boatman pulled them through the green. Once a Lannister patrol rode along the bank where brush broke and showed them. Lem and Angwy walked the bank high and loud 20 yards away and called the men thieves and cowards and drew them after with insults so practiced they were almost affectionate. The oars kissed the water and were quiet again. Riverrun rose from its rivers like a fish that had learned to be a castle. Its triangular walls looked bigger than they had any right to be, a trick of angles and age. The red and blue banner hung on its tower hung damp and heavy, and Arya thought if she stared hard enough she could make it snap in a wind that wasn't there. At the gate there were words that made the men on the wall speak past each other in their hurry to be first with the news, and then there was a lowering of bridges and the smell of wet stone. Catelyn Stark came down the steps like someone who had learned to move fast without looking as if she was running. She did not let her mouth become anything until she had a hand on her husband's sleeve and felt the weight of him through cloth. Then it happened all at once, like a thaw. Her face cracked and water ran, and she made a sound that had been sitting in her throat since the morning her husband had gone south. Ned put his hand to her cheek as if he might wipe the sound away and keep it for later. Robb was behind her, taller by grief and command both, and he stopped 3 steps up and gripped the rail and swallowed several things he would not want to say in front of his men. If gods have kindness in them, it must be the kindness of letting a man's family touch and count the bones of each other before they break the day again with orders. They did that. Catelyn kissed Arya until Arya squirmed and grinned and then hid and then endured. Robb set his hand in Gendry's in a way that made Gendry straighten his back because kings make you do that even when they are just boys you used to make mud pies with. Ned wept in the corner of his eye, the way mountains weep, and did not apologize for it. After, the hall filled with men who wanted to look at what had been returned to them and make of it a plan. The Blackfish stood with his arms crossed and his mouth doing that small fishhook of disdain he reserved for talk he had heard too many times. Roderick Castle had a tear in his mustache and would have been embarrassed by it if anyone had decided to say so, which no one did. The Great John laughed and clapped Ned on the back and called him a stubborn old loaf of bread that refused to go stale, and Ned said that was the nicest thing anyone had said to him in months. "We can use this," Roose Bolton said in a voice that always sounded to Arya like cloth being folded, soft and final. He looked at Ned as if he were a piece on a Syvas board that had been thought lost but might yet win a game if placed carefully. "A Stark at the head of Northmen makes men honest. We must decide if honesty is what is called for." "What is called for is my sister," Robb said, his voice hard in a way that made older men look at him again and remember that boys do not remain so under certain suns. "The Kingslayer will buy her." "He will buy more than that if we sell him dear," Bolton said. "The Lannisters will give a great many things to have their golden boy back, even if one of those things is the head of another boy who will never be a man." "We don't sell heads," Ned said. His voice had taken on the weariness of a man who has seen too many heads in discussion. "We trade men for men and oaths for roads. Jaime Lannister will never be safe in our hands. He will go on killing in our cells with his tongue and his hope. Let him go with a chain the length of the road to King's Landing and a woman beside him who will see him safe and see him shamed when he forgets what safety is made of. Caitlyn's head lifted as if someone had taken a thread and tugged it. "Brienne," she said, "of Tarth." "The big wench," the great John boomed, and if the word was an insult in some mouths, it could not be in his because he used it like a term of admiration for a horse that had surprised him with its endurance. "Aye, she can carry a Southron gold lion by the scruff like a bad pup." "She will go gladly," Caitlyn said, and in the small smile that crossed her mouth Arya saw a debt in her mother's heart being counted and paid. "She swore an oath to me in the rain after Renly fell, and we had nothing left of that but mud. She's been waiting for a task big enough to save the part of her that swore. We will give it to her." "Walder Frey will screech," Roose said mildly. "He screeches when the sun comes up in a place he didn't order it to. Walder Frey will get what he was promised," Ned said. "A marriage with Winterfell when the time is right and the girl is willing. I will not throw my son into a bed to stop an old man's mouth. We will bring him with us, and he will hold the bridge and mutter and then take his bread. He will not betray us while he still thinks there might be a way to count his chickens at our expense later." Robb flushed and did not hide it. "I will keep my word," he said, with a stiffness that had in it both pride and pain. "I will not embarrass my father or my house by doing otherwise." Caitlyn's hand found his and squeezed once hard. "You have already given more of yourself to oaths than any mother has a right to ask. If the gods are kind, they will give you a girl who laughs." Arya sat with her back to the cold stone of the hall and counted breaths and watched the plans grow like ivy. She thought of Jaime Lannister with his pretty hair and his cruel mouth and how men said his sword moved like light on water. She thought of Sansa behind windows that did not open, and of Sandor Clegane who stood in doorways like a bad thought. She thought of Tommen and his cat, and of boys who learn kindness and then are punished for keeping it. She thought of Baelish's thin smile and Varys' sighs, and of a dwarf with a fire that did not always serve the people who made it. She thought of Joffrey as a fact, then as a silence, then as a small red stain in a memory. That night, the wind changed and came out of the west, and with it came a scent of sea and something older that men call storm even when no cloud lifts from the horizon. Arya dreamed that she stood in a hall of faces whose eyes were not empty but waiting, and that one of them had her own nose broken and a mouth too set for a child. When she woke, her father's snore-two palates overmade the air a reassurance. Sandor Clegane rode with his cloak thrown back because sweat had slicked his burnt cheek and he had stopped caring who saw it last year, if not before. He did not know why he had left the city, and he knew exactly why. The words sat together like dogs who had learned to share a bone. The road did not care. He slept under hedges and in half-burned barns, and he woke sometimes with the sound of a girl's voice saying his name and could not tell if it was the one who sang or the one who would gladly have cut him the way she cut her lists, careful and to the quick. The Brotherhood found him because that is what they did to men like him. Lem called him dog and meant it. Angui put an arrow in the ground at his horse's feet from a distance that made even Sandor draw breath. Thuras flared fire and sermons, and Sandor ignored both. "Come to the Hollow," Tom said mildly, because he, unlike the rest, knew that saying less sometimes gets you more. "We'll feed the dog and give him a chance to prove he can stand on two legs." "I'll eat your food," Sandor said. "I'll not dance for your lightning boy." "You'll dance for your life," Lem said cheerfully. "Same as the rest of us." In the Hollow, Beric looked at Sandor with a history written in his face that had no page for this man and his burned smile. "You stood for a prince," he said. "Then you stood for a queen. Then you stood aside. Which is it, Sandor Clegane? Will you stand anywhere that pays you to keep your own feet?" "I'll stand where I'm not told lies," Sandor said. And if there was a desperate thing under his scorn, it did not show except to men like Thuras who had learned to hear sins in the slight changes in a man's laugh. "I won't kneel to your dead god or your live one. If you want blood, ask for it. Don't make a song around it." "A song is an asking," Tom said, and made a chord that sounded like agreement. Arya watched from the shadow of the root pillar, her mouth a thin line. She had asked the world to consider killing this man for her 100 times in her head, and the world had persisted in letting him breathe and eat and talk. The sight of him made her stomach hot. The memory of Joffrey being as small as he had been when the light went out of him made her understand something she would not have wanted a year ago. That your enemies are almost always more complicated than the thing you want to do to them. "We will give you a trial," Beric said to Sandor. "If you win, you go. If you lose, you pay. It is a poor justice, but it is the only coin we have to spend." "Trial by fire," Thuras half-jested, and then made the sign he made when he said a thing he hoped his god would find funny. "Trial by combat," Beric said and stood, and his men groaned and protested and begged other gods they had long ago said they did not believe in to make their lord stop being the sort of man who offered his life to strangers' fates. He took his sword up and Thuras set it alight, and Sandor laughed with a sound like a bark and bared his teeth. They fought in a ring where the roots made a kind of low fence and the fire on Beric's blade made the air taste of iron and old honey. Sandor moved like a man who had had his body taught to him by hurt and had decided to keep it anyway. Beric moved like a man who had emptied out the parts of himself that got in the way and left only the part that likes to live, which is a small fierce part that is, if you are lucky, clever. The dog hated fire and Beric's sword hated water and flesh both. And it made for a dance that was hard to watch. Arya did. She did not blink. Her father's hand found her shoulder and squeezed once at the moment when Sandor knocked the burning blade aside and stepped in and put his own point to the place under Beric's arm where Arya knew how soft it is. Beric fell. He fell carefully because men who have died learn to fall without arguing about it. The fire went out as if it had never been. Thuras was there before the sigh finished, his hands clutching Beric's ragged head, his mouth shaping an old word that had once meant nothing to him but wine and luck, and now meant too much. The hollow held its breath. Sandor breathed hard, eyes on the priest with something like anger and pity and contempt and hope all tangled. The word that Thuras said was ugly in his mouth and beautiful in the room. Beric came back with a gasp that made Arya's teeth hurt. "Again," he whispered, "because some men do not have the imagination to stop when hope offers them itself dressed as duty." Sandor dropped his sword as if it had gotten heavy. "Keep your witch tricks," he said. "I don't want to live in a world where dead men say what is justice." He made to leave, and Lem stepped in his way and found himself looking into eyes that did not care any more who lived or died. "Move! Go!" Beric said hoarsely. "He will meet what he has to meet out there like the rest of us." "Not yet," Arya said, and stepped forward because she had been swallowed too many times and spat out and now had teeth. "Not until he hears a thing." She stood in front of Sandor Clegane and made herself as tall as the memory of him in her fear would allow. "You killed a boy by a river because a prince wanted to see it." His mouth moved in a shape that had shame in it like an old scar. "I killed a butcher's boy," he said, "and men who begged and men who cursed and men who didn't know my name. Add me to your list and say it to the gods every night, and one day maybe I'll be tired enough to let them take me. But I won't kneel to your songs." She looked at him a long moment, measuring whether there was any mercy in her that did not make her weak. Her father's hand was still on her shoulder. She shrugged it off and found that she could do that and remain herself. "Go then," she said, "and don't ever let me see you again unless you mean to be better than you were." It sounded childish to her and exactly like the sort of thing she had a right to say. He nodded once, quick, as if any more might spill something he owed to no one, and left with the heavy tread of a man who does not expect to find a good thing around any corner and goes there anyway. They did not linger long after that. The riverlands were changing even as they walked, the villages more careful, the fields less certain of their harvest, the roads more and more the property of men with too many lions on their cloaks. Tywin Lannister had withdrawn from Harrenhal like a spider who had finished tasting the web it wove. The castle's old curse breathed easier when he left. Arya thought of the tickler and Polliver, and of a steel she used to have and did not, and put their names back in the top of the purse in her head. "Your needle," her father said quietly when they walked alone for a span under a hedgerow that had been carefully cut and then abandoned for 2 seasons too many. "Will you have it back when we find it?" "I will," she said, and tasted the will as if it were iron. "And I will put it to its proper use." "We will talk about that," he said mildly, which meant he would not forget and would choose his time carefully. They took the old road to the twins because Catelyn Stark was a woman who paid debts even to men she would rather not dine with. Walder Frey lined his bridge with his descendants like a man putting coins on a mantle and told them to pretend to be handsome. He blinked at the Stark who had returned from death without dying, as if the world had tried to cheat him of a bitterness he had prepared with such care. He muttered about promises and kissed Catelyn's hand and stared a little too long at Arya with a calculating dotard's gaze. Ned made the courtesies and Robb made the bolder promises and told Walder, in front of enough witnesses to make it law, that a Frey would have a place at Winterfell when winter ended and the garden could bear such fruit. Walder made a sound that meant he had been offered what he wanted and would punish people later for making him want it. They left the bridge unbloodied and with a piece of it in the shape of Oliver riding beside Robb, because Walder liked to plant little eyes in other men's gardens. Roose Bolton watched and did not move his face and said calmly that the leech he had left on his arm last night was very fat this morning, which must mean something. Great John Umber suggested something obscene and true. The army moved, as armies do, like a complicated animal with too many legs and its mind divided, toward 100 purposes and one end. In King's Landing, Marjorie Tyrell came to court with roses in her hair and a smile that had pity folded into it like the cream in a cake. Cersei set her teeth on that smile and could not make her jaw unclench. Tommen sat with his hands on his knees and tried to say the right things about hawking and hounds and forgot and said the true thing, which was that he missed his brother even though his brother had been unkind, and Marjorie's hand covered his because she had brothers and understood a little. Tyrion watched all of it through one good eye and one that still watered when he laughed too hard, and thought about how fast power moves in a city and how slow a man's opinion of himself changes. Varys came to him with a tidbit sweet and poisonous. Lord Eddard never reached the wall, he said, making tea in his thin, safe way. A misfortune for the wall and a fortune for some rustic in signboard where the story will be told for 10 years in exchange for ale. Or so the men who sent the men who sent the men to stop him will say. Your book grows fat, Tyrion said. It is only a ledger, Varys replied, and ledgers cannot tell you which numbers lie and which ones only err by accident. He looked out the window of a room that had never been meant for him and sighed the way a man sighs when the weather changes and his bones remember being poor. The North will make a shape of this, perhaps a shape that does not suit us. Nothing much suits us, Tyrion said, and turned the thought over in his head the way he would examine a coin for the tiny notch that meant it had been clipped. If Eddard Stark was with his own, the negotiations that would bring Sansa home and keep the North from burning everything down would get both easier and harder, which was the sort of truth that kept Tyrion's wine sour and his wit sharp. He sent a raven to his father that said what it could say without saying the thing it could not. He sent another to a man in the Vale who owed him a grudging favor and hated to pay it. He thought of Sansa Stark and the little brave way she held her chin, and of the way she had cried without a sound when he had told her the city would stand or fall on men who did not love it. He thought of the way children pay for their parents' promises and wondered if gods get tired of the taste of that. Daenerys Targaryen stood on the prow of a ship that had no name worth keeping and looked east toward a city that had too many. She had 3 small dragons and a husband made of fire and memory and a clutch of men who called her mother because they wanted something that had nothing to do with milk. She did not know yet that a throne made of knives was easier to sit on when you had never felt a man's knee under your cheek while he bled. She would learn because the world teaches you what you need to know if you live long enough. The North called banners because that is how you make warmth in cold places when the South forgets your name. White Harbor sent ships that had smelled the sea too long to fear it. Bear Island sent bears that wore women's faces. The Risswells came with good horse and bad tempers. The Karstarks brought sorrow in the shape of sons who should have had more summers, and Rickard Karstark's mouth began to turn down at the corners with old revenge. Catelyn watched it and put a pebble in her mind with his name written on it, because she had learned you keep such stones handy. You will need to build a small wall very quickly one day and be glad of the number. They met Tyrion's bridge of words with bridges made of men. Jaime Lannister went south in a chain and on horseback and hated both with equal fervor. Brienne rode at his side in armor that looked like a promise kept badly by a smith who had gotten too fond of rivets. He mocked her because that is how men like him mow down the wheat of their own terror and make the field neat enough to walk across. She did not answer him much because she was counting the steps between the thing she had sworn and the place where she could stop counting. When robbers came out of a wood and made demands more interestingly than strictly necessary, she knocked the leader off his horse with a backhand that made Jamie shut his mouth for a 3 count and then tell her she had no grace and too much strength and that both were sins. When they passed a burned village, she looked at the char and did not weep because she had learned that no one who burns you will give the tears back. In Riverrun, Ned and Catelyn spoke to each other in the precious measured language of people who have discovered that their time together is a gift the gods make a habit of taking back. They walked on the wall and spoke of the small things first, the shape Arya's jaw was making, which would be his if the gods let him keep it, the way Robb held his shoulders, which was hers when she was angry and did not wish to appear so. Then they spoke of the larger things, and the words made the night colder and then a little warmer because saying the worst things aloud sometimes lets the better things breathe. "I should have kept you home," he said. "You should have married me to Brandon," she answered, with the old affection that made the truth less cutting than it would have been. "You should have gone south sooner. You should have gone south later. We should have kept them all in a closet with bread and cheese until the world grew bored and left us alone." Her hand moved along the stone like she was petting a sleeping dog. "We did what we did. We will do what we must." "Arya," he said, and the name was a small prayer. "She is a river," Catelyn said. "She will find her own way to the sea even if we build rocks in the wrong place to stop her." Her mouth softened. "She killed a prince. You know. I knew before you told me. It is in her mouth when she sleeps. She puts a hand on her ribs as if the place under her arm is tender still. I do not forgive her and I do not condemn her. I am her mother. It means I do both in the same breath and then do neither and then only want to gather her up like a babe and hide her in the crook of a tree until men forget her name." He put his forehead to hers and closed the distance that had been the whole kingdom for too long. "We will send her somewhere the world loses track of. Or we will put a sword in her hand and teach her not to be killed by it. There is no third thing, is there?" "I am not sure I would choose one if there were," Catelyn said, honest and afraid and strong. "She is a wolf. She should not be penned where lambs learn to graze." Arya slept like a girl who had learned that sleep is a weapon as much as a kindness. She dreamed of water that did not reflect faces and of a coin in a man's hand and of words that opened doors. She dreamed that she stood with a woman with no name on a bridge that had no parapet and that the sky smelled of salt and black bread and dead eels. When she woke, her mouth was salty and she was hungrier than before, as if the dream had walked off with a part of her dinner. Robb's counsel argued itself into a shape. They would hold the west roads. They would take the fight to the foragers. They would choke the gold and let the pride starve. They would write to White Harbor to send more ships, and they would send ravens to the Eyrie to ask Lisa Arryn whether she intended to be a dove forever or if she had remembered, somewhere under all that fear, that once she had been a hawk. They would not, under any circumstances and with apologies to every god who enjoys hypocrisy, permit Ricard Karstark to take his private justice out into the hall in the shape of murder. Catelyn watched his mouth, and when the day came she spoke his name and her own hands shook only a little. Winterfell waited, and in it Bran taught himself to look with eyes that belonged to something that did not mind winter and was not so certain about spring. He dreamed of his father coming home by 3 roads, and in 2 of them his face was a shadow, and in one of them it was a face stitched with a new care, and his hands smelled of damp earth. He told no one. He learned to keep the dreams like birds, tucked under his vest, claws careful not to scratch his heart. Somewhere beyond the wall, a thing moved that had not moved in a long time. Men began to tell stories about blue eyes in the dark that were not made of smoke or fear. Jon Snow lit a fire and stared into it and thought about the sort of light that keeps men alive and the sort that only makes their deaths easier to see. He thought about turning south and finding a father and saying the things sons say and decided to go north instead because he had seen a map with too much white at the top and it had scared him in a way that made choice too easy. Gendry found a forge in Riverrun's belly that needed a boy with strong arms and no patience for talk. He made nails and spearheads and little iron hearts that the boys tied around their necks as if iron had kindness. He hammered things until the shape in his head matched the shape under his hands, which is a very pure sort of relief. He did not look at Arya much because when he did his chest felt like a bell, and he did not trust what men say when bells are ringing in them. Tyrion sat on a step in the hand solar and watched the city breathe and tried to count the number of ways the next year could go. He got to 7 and stopped because he had learned the trick of not indulging terror past the point where it made you stupid. He thought of a song he had heard Tom a 7 sing when the man had come to court for a day in disguise with a bundle of pretended herbs and a real knife. It was about a man who had a wife in every city and a purse in none and a laugh that made men forgive him. Tyrion did not forgive anyone. He counted the coins on his desk, and the number was wrong in a way that made him feel almost cheerful because a wrong number is an honest enemy at least. In The Twins, Lord Walder counted his grandchildren like beads on a rosary and muttered about insults not yet committed to make himself angry enough to be ready for when they came. In The Rock, Tywin counted victories like a man who was keeping house for a king he had invented, and his quill sang on the page. In Dragonstone, Stannis counted sins and found Melisandre had given him a way to pay for them that involved other men's blood and fewer letters than he had anticipated. In the Dreadfort, a man counted flayed skins and found the sum soothing. In the Vale, Lisa counted her fears and called them prudence and kissed her son's forehead too many times for anyone's comfort but her own. The road bent and bent again. It brought people together without asking them and took them apart without asking them, and no one ever got to have it their way for long. Arya stood on Riverrun's wall with her father and her mother and watched the river go where it meant to go. She thought of Bravos without knowing its name. She thought of faces without knowing why. She thought of a girl who had pushed a little sword into the tender place beneath a prince's arm and had made the world flinch and then keep moving. And she wondered if that girl had been herself or a ghost she would follow for the rest of her life, catching up in pieces. "Winter will come," Ned said, not as warning or promise this time, but as a simple weather report. "We will need to be more than what we are now." "I can be more," Arya said, not looking up. "I know," he said softly. "I am afraid you will be." He put his hand on her head for a moment and then let it fall. She did not lean into it. She did not step away. The river took a stick and did not explain where it went. The banners stirred without wind, and a raven turned above them once and flew inland, toward a dark that was not yet near enough to taste and would be, sooner than any of them wanted. In King's Landing, Sansa held a little book of songs in hands that had begun to show the shape of bone under them. Marjorie had given the book to her, and it smelled faintly of lavender and ink, and there were places where the edges of the pages held the imprint of someone else's careful fingers. She read verses about boys who had not existed and girls who had, and closed her eyes and sang a line very softly under her breath. Sandor would have called it foolishness. Tyrion would have called it medicine. Cersei would have called it a weapon if she had thought of it first. Sansa called it breath and took another. The city's bells sang at sunset, and no one could have said why. Sometimes the bells are only bells, and they teach men who listen too hard the right lesson by accident. The lesson was, not every sound is a summons. Some are just the world clearing its throat. Sansa put the book down, and for a moment her hand stayed in the air as if it held something heavier. Then she turned and went to sit with Tommen and the cat, and when the animal bit her thumb she did not cry out. She put her finger in her mouth and tasted iron and thought, "I will remember everything they forget." The next day men came back from the fords with news fitted to 1,000 mouths, and the day after that someone found a boy hanging from a tree with a sign on his chest that said what he had done and what he had not done. And the day after that a woman gave birth on the floor of a mill and named the child after a river because no man around had earned naming. Thuras lit a fire in the hollow with slow care, and Beric cleaned a nick on his blade with a cloth that had been a piece of a lady's dress. And Tom wrote a rhyme about unheroic men who saved each other and set it to a tune that could be hummed by tired drovers. Lem sharpened his insults. Angui shot a leaf out of a boy's hand to make a point and then apologized to the leaf. Brienne rode south with Jaime, and when he told her she was ugly she told him he was beautiful like a knife, and he laughed and hated her and then did not, little by little, in the way a man cannot help sometimes. They came to a river, whose name neither of them knew, and a woman with a dead child sewn into her belly looked up from the water and said that it did not matter, the names, because the dead did not keep them, and Brienne thought, helplessly, that she had also looked into a face once and seen a dead thing and a living thing both, and that the name had been King. Robb took a village and gave it back to its people, and when a cow lowed that night like a prayer someone answered without meaning to, and a child stirred. Catelyn spoke to Edmure about war the way mothers speak to girls about their first bleeding, because a woman who keeps a castle becomes priest and teacher both when the world insists that the man who should do it is out making winter early. Ned sat with the Blackfish and argued over maps with more affection than anger, which is a luxury men should indulge because time will steal it soon enough. Arya slipped through the castle the way water finds cracks, and sometimes she took bread from the kitchen because the boys with flour on their faces did not mind, and sometimes she took a look at a man's face and kept it because she thought she might need to remember it later. She practiced with a stick in a yard where training had been an afterthought, and men laughed at first and then looked away and then came to watch because the way she moved made them remember something they had lost. Harwin clapped her shoulder and told her her feet were better than her mouth, which was as close to poetry as he got. When the Raven came to Winterfell with a letter from Riverrun that said the words that men dress in honor and women taste only as relief, Maester Luwin read it twice and then set it down and cleaned his spectacles and then did a thing with his mouth that was either a smile or a man holding back a cry. He went to Bran and told him his father lived, and Bran nodded and said, like a lord, "Then we must feed more men." And Luwin laughed and cried properly then, because boys should be allowed to be boys around their tutors or the world is truly lost. The snows in the high north came early that year, scratching the tops of the pines as if a god had dragged a claw over them and tested their softness. The wall held. Men on it stamped their feet and cursed and were grateful for the chance to. Jon looked out and thought that a wall is a kind of promise you make to people you have never met, and that it was a good sort of life to keep such a promise if you could. He did not know that his father was thinking something like that at the same time, looking at Riverrun's walls and thinking of Winterfell's and how a wall is not only a thing to hide behind but sometimes a place to set your back and push. He held Catelyn's hand when they lay down and did not say the names of gods out loud because he had learned that sometimes prayer is listening with all your strength and not speaking at all. If there is a center to things, it is only for a breath at a time. People mistake those breaths for truths that last, and then they are surprised. For a while, Riverrun felt like a center. A place where daughters slept and fathers walked the walls and boys tried on crowns in their minds and mothers counted spoons and soldiers' names because someone had to. For a while, King's Landing felt like a center. A place where little boys sat straight and queens smiled and knives were kept in sheaths and wildfire cooled in its jars, and a clever man with a broken face made the city breathe in and out on time. For a while, the Riverlands felt like seam, where stitches hold or do not. It would not last. It never does. But for long enough to matter, Arya rose before the sun and went to the yard and worked until her breath made clouds and her shirt clung to her back. And then she went and found Gendry and told him his nails bent when they shouldn't, and he told her she was ugly when she grinned and then laughed when she told him he was too. Sansa fed a cat and sang a song under her breath, and Marjorie heard it and joined in, and the harmony made them both stronger. Sandor stole a chicken and did not kill the man who tried to stop him and did not understand why that left him feeling worse. Tyrion wrote a letter and then burned it and had a drink and did not sleep. Robb made a decision that would not kill a man for having killed his sons and then did later, because the world makes hypocrites of us all if we aim at anything but our own bellies. Ned sat with a whetstone and a knife and told Arya the story of every scar he had and the ones he did not, and she listened as if the sound of the stone was the drum by which she would march. When he finished, he handed her the stone and the blade and did not watch her. She sharpened the edge until it sang. The song was not beautiful. It did not need to be. It was a good song for the work at hand. And when she set the knife down, she did not think of princes. She thought of the river and of the way it takes and gives, and of the way it does not stop for anyone and does not apologize for it. And she thought that maybe she could learn that without becoming a thing that never loved anything it could be kept from. In a chamber that had seen men die and be born and swear things they had no intention of keeping, Catelyn took a quill and wrote a letter to her sister with the old affection very nearly intact. She asked for the girl who had grown up beside her to remember that sometimes courage is only what you call fear when it is busy. When she finished, she sanded the page and sealed it and held it to the candle for a breath. The way a woman pauses over bread she has made to feel the heat in it. Then she sent it and turned to the next bread and the next. The gods watched or did not. The old ones talked to leaves as they always had. The new ones weighed the smell of blood against the sound of bells. The red god warmed his hands at Thurs's fires and was not sure whether he had meant to keep Beric alive so many times or if it had been an accident. The drowned god waited and was patient because water makes a habit of outliving men. The faceless god looked in a mirror with no face at all and smiled, or did not. None of the gods, old or new, arranged the road so a girl would never have to choose again. None of them ever do. That is not their work. It is ours. Arya slept. She dreamed of a needle that was not a needle, and of a ship whose captain spoke to her without moving his mouth, and of a room in a city where the stones all had names and none of them would tell her what theirs were. When she woke, her father was already up and the yard was waiting for the shape she would make of it with her steps. And across the castle her mother was saying a name with a smile on it that did not hurt as much as it had. And far away her sister was looking at a boy king and thinking of the cat and of Lemon and of home. The day laid itself down before her like a path. She put her feet on it and did not look back.